Viewing the rapid development of Morotai with satisfaction, General MacArthur stated, "We shall shortly have an air and light naval base here within 300 miles of the Philippines." An airstrip at Pitoy was opened operationally for fighter aircraft on the 4th of October, and on that date the Morotai operation was officially terminated. Mopping up operations, however, were carried out for a long period against a stubborn enemy who continued to land troops by barge traffic. Strategically, the Halmahera-Philippines line had been penetrated, and the enemy's conquests to the south were imperiled by an imminent threat of Allied envelopment. The rolling up of the remainder of this line would cut off in the Netherlands East Indies the Japanese 16th and 19th Armies, a force estimated at nearly 200,000 men, and would sever essential supplies of oil and other war materials from the Japanese mainland. General MacArthur commented on the enemy and the future trend of the war in the following words: "We now dominate the Moluccas. I rejoice that it has been done with so little loss. Our campaign is entering upon its decisive stage. Japanese ground troops still fight with the greatest tenacity. The military quality of the rank and file remains of the highest. Their officer corps, however, deteriorates as you go up the scale. It is fundamentally based upon a caste and feudal system and does not represent strict professional merit. Therein lies Japan's weakness. Her sons are strong of limb and stout of heart, but weak in leadership. Gripped inexorably by a military hierarchy, that hierarchy is now failing the nation. It has had neither the imagination nor the foresighted ability to organize Japanese resources for a total war. Defeat now stares Japan in the face. Its barbaric codes have dominated Japanese character and culture for centuries, and have practiced a type of national savagery at strange variance with many basic impulses of the Japanese people. Its successful domination has been based largely on the people's belief in its infallibility. When public opinion realizes that its generals and admirals have failed in the field of actual combat and campaign, the revulsion produced in Japanese thought will be terrific. Therein lies a basis for ultimate hope that the Japanese citizen will cease his almost idolatrous worship of the military and readjust his thoughts along more rational lines. No sophistry can disguise the fact from him that the military has failed him in this, his greatest hour of need. That failure may mark the beginning of a new and ultimately happier era for him. His hour of decision is close at hand. Timed to coincide with the landings on Morotai, assaults against Peleliu and Angar in the Palau Islands were carried out by forces of the Central Pacific. Preceded by 2 days of extensive minesweeping and bombardment, the 1st Marine Division went ashore on Peleliu on the 15th of September. The beach defences, although heavily studded with mines, were quickly overrun, and by the evening of the next day, Peleliu Airfield, the primary objective of the operation, had been taken. Additional progress, however, proved difficult. The Allies had to contend not only with a well-organised and stubborn defence by the enemy, but also had to surmount the obstacles offered by a series of limestone ridges, transformed into a natural fortress over a period of years. The 81st Division, under Major General Paul J. Mueller, which successfully invaded Angkor on the 17th of September, dispatched a regimental combat team to assist in the capture of Peleliu and several smaller islands to the north. After heavy and prolonged fighting, Peleliu was finally subdued by the end of September. Sweeping around Babelthuap, which was defended by a garrison of roughly 1 1/2 divisions, the Allies invaded Kosol Roads, a large body of reef-enclosed water about 70 miles north of Peleliu. Kosol Pass and its roadstead were cleared and used as an anchorage for seaplanes and light naval vessels. On the 23rd of September, Ulithi Atoll, 35 miles to the northeast, was occupied by elements of the 81st Division and became the main forward naval base of operations against the Philippines. With the termination of the Morotai and Palau operations, the threat of a possible enemy flank attack was removed, and the Allied forces could now proceed freely with the impending assault on the Philippines. The operation to take Leyte was a most ambitious and difficult undertaking. The objective area was located over 500 miles from Allied fighter bases on Morotai and Palau, beyond the effective range of fighter cover. At the same time, it was in the center of a Japanese network of airfields covering the Philippines. The islands would doubtless be defended to the limit of the enemy's capabilities, probably even at the risk of losing his heretofore husbanded navy, since a successful Allied landing on Leyte would presage the eventual reoccupation of the entire Philippine area. The Japanese could reinforce their positions by bringing in troops and supplies from their rear lines, whereas, without air bases in the vicinity, the Allied forces would have to rely on naval aircraft to prevent enemy supply and reinforcement convoys from reaching the area. Again, as at Hollandia, Southwest Pacific Area, SWPA forces would advance beyond the range of their own land-based fighter cover and put themselves under the temporary protection of carrier planes for the assault phase. The success of the operation, even after a landing was secured, would depend on the ability of Allied naval forces to keep the enemy from building up a preponderance of strength on Leyte and adjoining Samar, and to prevent enemy naval craft from attacking shipping in the beachhead area. Careful study preceded the selection of the landing beaches and the direction of the inland thrust on Leyte. A special report of the Allied Geographical Section detailing airfields, landing beaches and roads was furnished to the planning staff months ahead of the actual invasion. Terrain studies covering all areas of the Philippines earmarked for invasion following Leyte provided necessary details on which to base the overall strategy. Even the assault troops were supplied with pocket-size handbooks containing essential information, maps and photographs on local topography, locations of objectives, and conditions to be encountered. The Allied forces were well informed. On the basis of these intelligence reports, confirmed by last-minute aerial photographic reconnaissance, the northeastern coastal plain of Leyte was selected as the most suitable for the assault. Seizure of the 18-mile stretch between Dulag and San Jose would permit the early capture of the important Tacloban airfield and make possible the occupation and use of the airfield system under development at Dulag. It would permit domination of vital San Juanico Strait and place the invading forces within striking distance of Panayan Strait to the south. Intelligence reports indicated that the beach area would not be heavily defended, although some fortifications were being prepared along the inland road net. An entirely new organization called the Army Service Command was set up for logistic support of the assault force and for base development and construction on Leyte. It was made a subordinate echelon of the United States Army Services of Supply, the organization that had furnished supplies to Allied troops in their drive from Australia to the Halmaheras. Major General Hugh J. Casey, formerly General MacArthur's chief engineer, was given command of this new unit and directed to prepare and execute plans for the establishment and development of new bases in the Philippines in accordance with Services of Supply directives. Since the immediate problem was to develop an air base and transshipment port at Leyte, General Casey was instructed to plan and fulfill the combat logistical requirements for the operations of the Sixth Army after the Leyte landing was accomplished. To carry out this task as effectively as possible, the Army Service Command was put under the direct control of General Kruger, meanwhile maintaining close liaison with Services of Supply, from which it drew materiel and personnel. As soon as the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the advance date of the 20th of October for the Leyte attack, the machinery for the organization of the vast task force was set in motion. Under the original December invasion plan, it was intended that SWPA would furnish the entire troop complement necessary to carry out the assault. Australian forces were to take over combat responsibility in New Guinea and New Britain, and free United States units for the Philippine action. The relief of the US 37th and 40th Divisions in these areas, scheduled originally for October and November, could not be accomplished in time to meet the new target date. Consequently, the Central Pacific area made the 24 Corps available to General MacArthur as a substitute for these divisions. Southwest Pacific Area ground combat forces for the Leyte operation consisted of the X-Corps, the major components of which were the 1st Cavalry and the 24th Infantry Divisions, both veteran units. This corps was loaded on ships of Admiral Barbé's 7th Amphibious Force, Task Force 78 of the 7th Fleet, the same force which had so meritoriously conducted all previous major assault landings in the Southwest Pacific. Admiral Barbé's command was reinforced for the Leyte attack by shipping from Central Pacific sources. This augmented group, known as the Northern Attack Force, had the primary mission of landing the X-Corps on beaches from Palo to Dulag on the eastern coast of Leyte. Part of the convoy carrying the X-Corps headquarters and corps troops, the 24th Division and the 6th Ranger Battalion, departed from Hollandia on the 13th of October. It rendezvoused on the 15th with the remainder of Admiral Barbé's fleet units, which had carried the 1st Cavalry Division and reinforcing units from Manus Island. The 24 Corps, less the 77th Infantry Division on Guam, had been combat-loaded at Hawaii to be carried to Yap and Wolai by Vice ADM. Theodore S. Wilkinson's 3rd Amphibious Force, Task Force 33 of the 3rd Fleet. For the Leyte operation, Admiral Wilkinson's command was redesignated Task Force 79, the Southern Attack Force, and was transferred to the 7th Fleet. The mission of the Southern Attack Force was to land and establish the 20T4 Corps, including the 7th and 96th Divisions, on beaches between San Jose and Dulag on the eastern coast of Leyte. The convoy, still loaded as for the Yap operation, left Hawaii on the 15th of September, resupplied at Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, and then proceeded to the Admiralties, where some changes were made in the loading dispositions. The LST group left Manus Island on the 11th of October, and the remainder of the convoy, consisting of the faster transports, departed on the 14th. Both X-Corps and 24 Corps were under the 6th Army, commanded by General Kruger, who had led the American ground combat echelons of the Southwest Pacific from New Britain to Morotai, with unvarying success. Task Forces 78 and 79 were controlled by Admiral Kincaid, commander of the Allied naval forces in the Southwest Pacific area and of the United States 7th Fleet. In addition to responsibility for these two task forces, Admiral Kincaid also had the overall command of Task Force 77, the Central Attack Force. The battleships and cruisers of Task Force 77 were under Rear ADM. J.B. Oldendorf, while the escort carriers were led by Rear ADM, T.L. Sprague. Many of these warships had seen long service and were borrowed for the occasion from units of the size and scope of the Leyte assault demanded the full utilization of all available resources in the Pacific theater. Accordingly, Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet was called upon to assist in the operation by providing tactical and strategic support and by protecting the forces involved in the amphibious landings. The Admiral's flag covered 4 great striking groups, each consisting of fast carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and the newest American battleships. These ships were to cruise as far as the Ryukyus and Mindanao, striking heavy blows against Japanese installations, planes, and surface craft whenever the opportunity arose in order to weaken the enemy's expected counteractions. Since the Leyte landing beaches were beyond the range of land-based fighter protection, carriers of the Third Fleet were scheduled to be back in position before the 20th of October to support the assault phases of the operation and to cover the ground troops. Additional air support for the landing and convoy cover was to be provided by escort carriers of the 7th Fleet. This naval air strength was coordinated with General Kenny's Allied Air Force, which was assigned a secondary role, the protection of the rear and the southern flank until airfields could be developed on Leyte. With the completion of new bases, General MacArthur's air umbrella would move forward once more to shelter his troops, but in the meantime the 5th and 13th Air Forces were to hit targets on Mindanao and in the Netherlands, East Indies, from their bases in New Guinea and Morotai. Working in close conjunction with the 13th Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force Command of the Allied Air Force, under Air Vice Marshal William D. Bostock, was to protect the rear and assist in the preliminary neutralization of Japanese installations in the Netherlands, East Indies. To further the offensive effort, search planes of the Allied Air Force were assigned to cover the eastern areas of the Indies, most of the Philippine archipelago, and parts of the South China Sea in strikes against enemy air bases. The operations instructions detailing the responsibilities and missions of the forces involved were published on the 21st of September. They are characteristic of the GHQ orders that moved complex armies along an advance of thousands of miles. General Headquarters, Southwest Pacific Area, APO 500, the 21st of September 1944. 1. A. See Current Intelligence Summaries and Annex Number 3, Intelligence. B. Allied forces occupy the line, Mariana, Ulithi, Palau, Morotai, and control the approaches to the southern and eastern Philippines. C. The Third Fleet, Admiral W. H. Halsey commanding, supports the Leyte Gulf, Surigao Strait operation by 1. Containing or destroying the Japanese fleet. 2. Destruction of hostile air and shipping in the Formosa, Luzon, Visayas and Mindanao areas during the period A9 through A3, and from A-Day through A+30 as necessary to maintain their continued neutralization. 3. Destruction of ground defences and installations and shipping in the objectives and adjoining enemy supporting areas from A2 until the escort carriers assume the mission of direct support. 4. Providing direct support of the landing and subsequent operations by fast carrier aircraft as required. D. Coordination of operations of the Third Fleet and Southwest Pacific Naval and Air Forces will be published later. EZ time, Zone 9, will be used during the operation. 2. A. Forces of the Southwest Pacific, covered and supported by the Third Fleet, will continue the offensive to reoccupy the Philippines by seizing and occupying objectives in the Leyte and Western Samar areas, and will establish therein naval, air and logistic facilities for the support of subsequent operations. B. Target date of a day, the 20th of October 1944. Sea Forces 1. 6th U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, U.S. Army. As constituted, elements assigned by subsequent orders to 8th U.S. Army. 6th U.S. Army Reserve, 77th U.S. Infantry Division, Guam. 6th U.S. Infantry Division, Cape San Rapor, Dutch New Guinea. Forces allocated for the operation as designated in Annex Number 1. Tentative troop list for the operation. The exact composition of the landing force as designated by Commanding General 6th U.S. Army. 2. 1st Australian Army, Lieutenant General V.A.H. Sturdy, CBE, as constituted. 3. 8th U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger, U.S. Army, as later specified. 4. Allied Naval Forces, Vice Admiral T.C. Kincaid, U.S. Navy, as reinforced. 5. Allied Air Forces, Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, U.S. Army, as constituted. 6. USASOS, Major General J.L. Frink, U.S. Army, as constituted. 3A. The 6th U.S. Army, supported by the Allied Naval and Air Forces, will 1. By overwater operations, seize and occupy. 4. Prepare to conduct such operations as may be later directed by this headquarters to A. Complete the consolidation of Samar. B. Destroy or contain hostile garrisons in the Visayas. 5. Occupy and defend sites for radar and air warning installations, as arranged with the Commander's Allied Naval and Air Forces. 6. Assume control of and direct the operations of Filipino forces of the 9th Military District, Leyte Samar. 7. Establish facilities for minor naval operations at the earliest practicable date in the Leyte Samar area, as arranged with the Commander Allied Naval Forces, and initiate the establishment of naval, air and logistic facilities for the support of subsequent operations to reoccupy the Philippines as directed in Annex Number 4, Logistics, and Annex Number 6, Engineer, and as later directed by this headquarters. 8. Establish air facilities in the Leyte area with objectives as follows. A. First objective, 1 fighter group, P-38, immediately following the assault, and 1 fighter group, P-40, by A+5 for 1 night fighter squadron. B. Second objective, additional by A+15. C. Third objective, additional by A+30. D. Fourth objective, additional by A+45. E. Fifth objective, additional by A+60. F. as later designated, 1 Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, 1 Photo Squadron, 1 Medium Bomb Group plus 1 Squadron POA, 3 PBY Squadrons, tender-based, 1 VMR Squadron, Marine, 2 Light Bomb Groups, A-20, 1 Air-Sea Rescue Squadron, 1 Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, 1 Fighter Group, P-38, 1 Fighter Group, P-47, 1 PB-4Y Squadron, Air each, 2 Heavy Bomb Groups, 1 Lab Squadron, 1 Photo Squadron, F-5, 1 PB-4Y Squadron, Air IC, 2 Troop Carrier Groups, 1 Combat Mapping Squadron, Air H. The Commanding General 8th U.S. Army, supported by the Allied Naval and Air Forces, will 1. Relieve the 6th Army of missions in New Guinea, the Admiralties, New Britain and the Morotai area as later directed by this headquarters. 2. Prepare to relieve the 6th U.S. Army in the Visayan area as later directed by this headquarters. 3. Assist the Commanding General 6th U.S. Army by training, staging and mounting units of the 6th U.S. Army in the 8th U.S. Army area of responsibility as arranged with the Commanding General 6th U.S. Army, C. The 1st Australian Army, supported by the Allied Naval and Air Forces, will continue. 1. The defence of naval and air installations within assigned areas of combat responsibility. 2. The neutralisation of Japanese forces within assigned areas, seizing every opportunity for the destruction of hostile forces. D. The Commander Allied Naval Forces, while continuing present missions, will 1. Transport and establish landing forces ashore in Leyte Gulf Surigao Strait areas, as arranged with the Commanding General 6th U.S. Army. 2. Support the operation by a. Providing air protection for convoys and naval task forces, and direct air support for the landing and subsequent operations, supplemented as arranged with the Commander 3rd Fleet and the Commander Allied Air Forces. b. Arranging direct air support and cover with carrier aircraft for mine-sweeping and preliminary landings in the Leyte Gulf area during the period A2 to the time escort carriers assume the mission of direct support on A-Day. c. Transporting supporting troops and their supplies as required to the Leyte Gulf Surigao Strait area in naval assault shipping. d. Denying Japanese reinforcement of the Leyte area from the Samar, Western Visayas, and northeastern Mindanao areas. e. Clearing the Surigao Strait area of hostile naval forces and shipping and sweeping the Surigao Strait to open it for naval operations and shipping in the Camotes Sea and adjacent waters, in conjunction with operations of the 6th U.S. Army. 3. Provide submarine defense reconnaissance along probable routes of hostile naval forces and of waterborne reinforcements and supplies. 4. Provide lifeguard services as required. 5. Transfer to the Commander Allied Air Forces the mission of direct air support when landed fighters and bombers are established and operational as later arranged. E. The Commander Allied Air Forces, while continuing present missions, will 1. Establish and maintain air superiority in the Leyte area. 2. Neutralize enemy air and naval installations and shipping in the Leyte Gulf area and throughout the central and southern Philippines to support the operations of the 6th U.S. Army. 3. Provide the required air support for the naval forces and ground forces as necessary. 4. Provide photo reconnaissance and mapping of landing zones and operational objectives in support of 6th U.S. Army operations. 5. Provide the necessary air transportation support and assistance to the 6th U.S. Army in transporting personnel, supplies, and equipment as required. 6. Establish and maintain air communication with 6th U.S. Army headquarters. E. Other plans and data necessary for the support of the operation by the fast carrier forces. 7. Area of responsibility for naval and air operations of the 3rd Fleet and Southwest Pacific Forces will be designated later. 8. Instructions for long-range reconnaissance and bombing and attack restrictions will be issued in subsequent operations instructions. 9. Annex. Number 1 indicates the tentative troops list for the operation, and Annex Number 2 indicates the troop movements for the concentration. 4. See Annex Number 4, Logistics, to be issued later. 5. See Annex Number 5, Communications. B. Command Posts. Pacific Ocean Areas, Hawaii. 3rd Fleet, afloat. General Headquarters, Southwest Pacific Area, Hollandia. Rear Echelon, Brisbane. Advanced Echelon, Leyte. Date and hour of opening to be announced later. 6th U.S. Army, Leyte, as announced by Commanding General 6th U.S. Army. Rear Echelon, Hollandia. 1st Australian Army, Low. 8th U.S. Army, Hollandia. Allied Naval Forces, Hollandia. Rear Echelon, Brisbane. Allied Air Forces, Hollandia. Rear Echelon, Brisbane. United States Army Services of Supply, Hollandia. Rear Echelon, Brisbane. By command of General MacArthur, R.K. Sutherland, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army, Chief of Staff, /S/S.J. Chamberlain, S.J. Chamberlain, Major General GSC, AST Chief of Staff, G1. The date for the invasion of the Central Philippines had been advanced to strike the Japanese, while their defense preparations were still generally incomplete. The original December target date would have given the enemy 2 more months to strengthen his positions and redeploy his forces. By seizing the opportunity to strike him at a disadvantage, however, the already considerable logistic problems inherent in operations conducted over great water distances were further complicated by the fact that the change in schedule came only 34 days prior to the new assault date. The cancellation of the landings on Mindanao, which were originally intended to provide land-based air cover for the operation, altered the whole system of logistical support. These initially scheduled landings were to have been supplied from New Guinea bases. The Leyte operation, however, was partially supported directly from ports on the west coast of the United States. Coordination of the loading of supplies and equipment in 2 such distant areas necessitated the utmost care and timing. An added logistic difficulty was presented with the decision to employ the 20T4 Corps in the Leyte operation. This corps was a Pacific Ocean Areas Corps, and, at the time, was actually aboard ship ready to sail for the operation against Yap, which was cancelled. Shipping for the support of this corps had been loaded to accord with the plans of the Pacific Ocean Areas, which did not fit well into the plans of the Southwest Pacific for the support of the Leyte operation. This shipping was, in fact, suited only for the specific support of the 24 Corps, and it lacked the flexibility of standard loading employed by the Southwest Pacific, which would have made it suitable to support any troops without regard to type or composition. Utilization of the 24 Corps shipping during the critical phases of the operation was extremely difficult, and for a time its use was postponed in favor of the more flexible standard-loaded ships. An examination of Japanese shipping routes and facilities for supply and reinforcement disclosed substantial transport traffic between Japan proper and the Philippines. While their shipping potential was considerably reduced from the level of the previous year, the Japanese were still in a position to give ready supply and reinforcement to their forces in the Philippines area. According to the best reports, Japanese strength in the Philippines on the 30th of September 1944 included approximately 224,000 ground troops, in addition to air personnel, improvised labor units, and civilians. Reinforcements, moreover, were constantly arriving to bolster their positions. During the month of October, the estimate of enemy strength was increased by roughly 50,000 men, the calculated increment of fresh troops and reinforcements. This increase reflected continued preparations by the Japanese to strengthen their Philippine bastion. Evidence indicated that they were doing everything possible to meet the coming Allied assault on the Philippines, which they considered increasingly imminent. Headquarters of the Japanese Southern Army was located at Manila, and the 35th Army had its headquarters at Cebu. Under their command were some 9 or 10 divisions of ground troops, plus auxiliary units situated chiefly in Luzon and Mindanao. This distribution afforded the Allies an excellent opportunity to drive a wedge between the 2 islands and divide the enemy forces. Air and naval personnel were scattered at various positions in the archipelago, with the largest concentrations located in Luzon. Naval forces maintained minefields at all important water approaches and inland sea areas that were considered likely points for Allied thrusts. The invasion of the Philippines would bring the long-awaited day of liberation to 17 million Filipinos. While anxious for an early defeat of the Japanese forces throughout the islands, General MacArthur insisted on a careful selection of attack objectives and minimum destruction to Filipino life and property. He realized that here was a great moral issue involving a friendly civilian population. One of the purposes of the Philippine campaign is to liberate the Filipinos. They will not understand liberation if accomplished by indiscriminate destruction of their homes, their possessions, their civilization, and their own lives. Humanity and our moral standing throughout the Far East dictate that the destruction of lives and property in the Philippines be held to a minimum, compatible with the assurance of a successful military campaign. Indications are that in some localities the Japanese are evacuating cities, leaving Filipinos in residence, either failing to warn them or compelling them to stay. Aerial bombing causes the greatest destruction. Our objective in areas we are to occupy is to destroy totally hostile efforts in order to ensure our own success. In other areas, we neutralize to weaken any hostile effort which may tend to increase resistance to our occupation objectives. In the latter areas, our attack objectives are primarily airfields and shipping, not metropolitan areas or villages or barrios. To the extent possible, we must preserve port facilities that we plan to use. The commander of Allied air forces will, and CINCPAC is requested, to issue general instructions in accordance with the above objective of minimizing destruction of life and property of Filipinos. Aside from the matter of physical destruction of Filipino life and property, General MacArthur was well aware of the importance of restoring to the Philippines a degree of freedom at least equal to that in existence before 1942. In a letter to Major General John Hildring, Director of the Civil Affairs Division of the War Department, General MacArthur stated, "It is essential, in any plans for the control of civil affairs, that the measure of freedom and liberty given to the Filipino people be at least comparable to that enjoyed under the Commonwealth government before Japanese occupation. It would be a matter of gravest concern if restrictions were imposed, whether by direct or by individual means, in excess of those existing before the war. If any impressions were created that the United States is curtailing rather than expanding liberties, the most unfortunate repercussions might be expected. The only restrictions which should be imposed are the minimum required by military necessity, and these should be removed as quickly as possible. I repeat, utmost care should be taken that an imperialistic attitude not be introduced into the situation under the guise of military operations and necessity. This would be entirely alien to the spirit of recent legislation passed by Congress and the announced purposes of the President of the United States." As the Leyte invasion date approached, the Allies increased the intensity of their air raids against important Japanese positions. Planes of the Far Eastern Air Force and the Third Fleet ranged over the western Pacific from Borneo to the Bonins and continued to pound the enemy's ground and harbour installations. The 7th Air Force, from freshly built bases on Peleliu Island, searched the Palau area and raided the Bicol provinces of Luzon. The 14th Air Force, based in China, joined in the all-out assault with intermittent blows against Hong Kong and Formosa in diversionary operations. From 10, the 16th of October, the U.S. Third Fleet launched its planes against Okinawa and Formosa in the greatest carrier strike of the war. The Japanese reacted violently to this intrusion into their inner perimeter and expended their planes on a lavish scale to counter the Allied attack. The resultant clash was one of the greatest air battles between carrier and land-based air power of the Pacific War. The Allied forces won a telling victory in the Formosan strike and inflicted great losses on the Japanese both in planes and in trained pilots. Without a pause, successive attacks were then directed against Luzon and the Visayas as the Allied invasion forces put the finishing touches on their amphibious preparations. In addition to the actual physical destruction inflicted on the Japanese in the Formosa attack, the Third Fleet's carrier raid had other important and far-reaching results. Formosa was an important arsenal for the supply and repair of the enemy air forces assigned to the protection of the Philippines, and the damage effected by the Allied strike seriously hampered the maintenance of subsequent air operations in Leyte and Luzon. Then, too, the approach of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet so close to Formosa led the Japanese High Command into a series of strategical errors. The prospect of finishing off a major portion of the US task force was too inviting to resist. As a result, the Japanese diverted 150 planes and the last of the trained pilot strength of ADM Jisaburo Ozawa's Third Fleet to accomplish this foredoomed mission. This attacking force was almost entirely destroyed, stripping the Japanese of any effective carrier plane power for use against the Allied landings in Leyte and influencing their defensive naval strategy in the Philippines. At this time, too, a naval task force under ADM Kiyohide Shima was detached on the same futile task of destruction, additionally denuding Admiral Ozawa's fleet of cruiser and destroyer strength, which it badly needed. This task force, instead of fulfilling its original mission as part of the Japanese Third Fleet's striking arm, was destined to play a lone and insignificant role in the forthcoming battle for Leyte Gulf. The subsequent enemy exaggerated damage reports caused the Japanese to reassess the probable date of the coming Allied invasion of the Philippines. Figuring that it was impossible for the Allies to replace their losses and repair the estimated damage to their fleet units before the end of November, the Japanese thought they had at least another month in which to strengthen their defensive measures in the Philippines. The softening up operations were now finished, and there remained only the final shore bombardment prior to the actual landing. Well over 1,000 enemy aircraft of all types had been destroyed by Allied air and naval forces during the preceding 2 weeks. Vast amounts of enemy shipping had been sunk or damaged. The enemy's most likely sources of reinforcement for planes and men, Luzon, Formosa, and the Ryukyus, had been severely pounded. Whether Japanese communications had been sufficiently crippled to prevent an effective reinforcement of the troops on Leyte would soon be revealed. Guerrilla reports and other intelligence sources had given the Allies a good picture of what they would meet after their landing, but the enemy, on the other hand, had little precise information concerning Allied invasion plans. From the standpoint of strategy, the Japanese calculated that the Allies would strike the Philippines soon after the Morotai and Palau landings. Tactically, however, they did not know precisely where, when, or in what strength the blow would fall. Estimates varied considerably both as to time and place. It was generally anticipated that the Allies would invade Mindanao first, then the central Philippines, and finally Luzon. The stage was set, and the Allies were ready. In the Philippines, the people were eager to assist in the long-awaited battle for their liberation. After 2.5 years of planning and fighting, General MacArthur could now fulfill his promise and reopen the gates of the Philippines to freedom. The Leyte operation was to be the crucial battle of the war in the Pacific. On its outcome would depend the fate of the Philippines and the future course of the war against Japan. Located in the heart of the archipelago, Leyte was the focal point where the Southwest Pacific forces of General MacArthur were to converge with the Central Pacific forces of Admiral Nimitz in a mighty assault to wrest the Philippines from the hands of the enemy. With Leyte under General MacArthur's control, the other islands would be within effective striking distance of his ground and air forces. Leyte was to be the anvil against which he would hammer the Japanese into submission in the central Philippines, the springboard from which he would proceed to the conquest of Luzon for the final attack against Japan itself. Military necessity demanded that the Allies achieve a decisive victory on Leyte. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz were committed to employing the maximum resources at their command. It was axiomatic, too, that the Japanese would fight to the bitter end to save the Philippines. The war situation had grown progressively worse for Japan, and by the autumn of 1944 her position was both critical and desperate. No longer were the Allies held at the outer periphery of her defence system. They were now poised with their full power at the very threshold of her inner structure, and if they should break through, the homeland itself would stand dangerously exposed, an inviting target for the next invasion. With the initiative entirely in Allied hands, the war had reached that decisive stage where another important Japanese defeat would seal the ultimate fate of Japan's empire and destroy a centuries-old tradition of invincibility. The Philippines would probably offer the last chance for the Japanese army to recover its lost prestige and gain a victory over General MacArthur's forces. To achieve this victory, the Japanese battle fleet would undoubtedly come forth in full strength to throw back all invasion efforts. If the Japanese were to realize the rapidly diminishing hope of stemming the surging American tide, the decisive battle would have to be in the Philippines. The alternative of failure would be inevitable defeat. The decision had to be pressed. The plan for the ground operations in the capture of Leyte comprised 4 main phases. Phase 1 covered minor preliminary landings to secure the small islands lying across the entrance to Leyte Gulf. Phase 2 included the main amphibious assaults on Leyte from Dulag to Tacloban and called for the seizure of the airstrip, an advance through Leyte Valley, and the opening of San Juanico and Panayon Straits. Phase 3 consisted of the necessary overland and shore-to-shore operations to complete the capture of Leyte and the seizure of southern Samar. Phase 4 contemplated the occupation of the remainder of Samar and the further neutralization of enemy positions in the Visayas. The first landings to mark the invasion of the Philippines were made on 3 small islands that guarded the eastern approaches to Leyte Gulf. Despite cyclonic storms and heavy seas, elements of the 6th Ranger Battalion, augmented by 1 company of the 21st Infantry, went ashore on Suluan and Dinagat Islands on the 17th of October 1944. Heavy mists shrouded their approach, and they were opposed only by the rough surf and battering winds. Homenhon Island was occupied the next day. All 3 islands were quickly cleared of small enemy garrisons and radio installations, while minesweepers and demolition teams cooperated to sweep the waters and the beaches of all obstacles potentially dangerous to the main operation. On the 20th of October, the largest mass of naval assault craft and warships ever concentrated in the Pacific sailed boldly into Leyte Gulf. The landing beaches and tactically important rear areas had already been softened by a continuous 2-day ship and plane bombardment. After an additional morning barrage, the landing troops were ready to go ashore. The main assault on the east coast of Leyte began at 10 o'clock in the morning, with landings along an 18-mile front between the 2 small villages of Dulag and San Jose. X-Corps, comprising the 1st Cavalry and the 24th Divisions, covered the right flank of the landings to the north. WWII 4 Corps, consisting of the 7th and 96th Divisions, secured the left flank. Both shores of Panayon Strait at the southern tip of the island were seized by a single regimental combat team of the 21st Infantry, which had gone ashore an hour prior to the main assault. General MacArthur's stirring promise to return to the Philippines was fulfilled shortly after the main landings. In a drenching rain, he strode ashore on the muddy beachhead near Palo, following close to the assault echelons, and heralded the coming hour of liberation. Speaking to millions of waiting Filipinos over a portable radio set, he declared, "This is the voice of freedom, General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our 2 peoples. We have come, dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily life, and of restoring, upon a foundation of indestructible strength, the liberties of your people. At my side is your president, Sergio Osmeña, worthy succeller of that great patriot, Manuel Quezon, with members of his cabinet. The seat of your government is now therefore firmly re-established on Philippine soil. The hour of your redemption is here. Your patriots have demonstrated an unwavering and resolute devotion to the principles of freedom that challenges the best that is written on the pages of human history. I now call upon your full effort that the enemy may know from the temper of an aroused and outraged people within that he has a force there to contend with no less violent than is the force committed from without. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. As the liner of battle rolls forward to bring you within the zone of operations, rise and strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters, strike. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled. The guidance of divine God points the way. follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. Opposition at the landing beaches was negligible, and first-day casualties resulted primarily from a few well-placed mortar and artillery pieces that remained unsilenced by the preliminary air and naval bombardment. In the San Jose sector, the X Corps advanced quickly, and by mid-afternoon, the 1st Cavalry Division, supported by tanks, had secured Tacloban Airfield, the most important early objective. At the same time, the 24th Division pressed forward, fighting its way inland in the area of the Palo-Tacloban Highway. The objective in this sector was a height dominating the entire landing beach area near Palo, labelled Hill 522. As this hill commanded both the highway system and the beaches, the Japanese had fortified it with trenches, caves, and cleverly concealed emplacements that would offer serious opposition to an attacking force. A slight but serious miscalculation on the part of the enemy, however, enabled the 24th Division to seize the hill with a minimum of loss. The severity of the naval, air, and artillery bombardment had forced the Japanese to leave their guns and take temporary refuge in the safer ground below. As soon as the shelling stopped, they began their move back up the slopes to reoccupy their commanding positions and open fire on the advancing Americans. They were too late. So swift was the progress of the invading forces that troops of the 24th Division were already on the crest of the hill to meet and destroy the returning enemy. In the Dulag sector, which was the responsibility of the 24 Corps, the 96th Division advanced against stiffening resistance, but by early afternoon it had carried its attack inland from 1,000 to 3,000 yards. On the left flank of the Corps, the 7th Division encountered little initial opposition after the landing and pushed steadily forward to secure Dulag Airdrome on the 21st of October. The airfield, however, situated in the flat floodplain of the Marabang River, was not suitable for immediate use. Poor drainage, numerous small swamps, and the thick sedimentary silt of the plain rendered the airstrips generally unusable until well toward the end of November. In the X Corps sector, unloading was delayed by unfavourable terrain to the rear of the beach. Although sporadic enemy mortar and artillery fire hampered the fast discharge of cargo and landing of needed artillery, X Corps assault echelons completed unloading by the 5th day after the landing. They were ably assisted by the untiring efforts of the troops of the 2nd Engineer Special Brigade, veterans of almost every previous amphibious operation in the Southwest Pacific. Beach conditions in the 34 Corps sector varied, but the presence of snipers and enemy mortar fire, together with the lack of sufficient unloading personnel, were temporary obstacles to the speedy disembarkation of men and material. Delay in unloading, however, did not prevent the establishment of beachheads and early advances inland by both corps. General MacArthur, in personal command of the operation, summarized the landings and initial accomplishments of the invasion forces. In a major amphibious operation, we have seized the eastern coast of Leyte Island in the Philippines, 600 miles north of Matota, and 2,500 miles from Milne Bay, from whence our offensive started nearly 16 months ago. This point of entry in the Visayas is midway between Luzon and Mindanao, and at one stroke splits in two the Japanese forces in the Philippines. The enemy's anticipation of attack in Mindanao caused him to be caught unawares in Leyte, and beachheads in the Tacloban area were secured with small casualties. The landing was preceded by heavy naval and air bombardments, which were devastating in effect. Our ground troops are rapidly extending their positions, and supplies and heavy equipment are already flowing ashore in great volume. The troops comprise elements of the 6th U.S. Army, to which are attached units from the Central Pacific, with supporting elements. The naval forces consist of the 7th U.S. Fleet, the Australian Squadron, and supporting elements of the 3rd U.S. Fleet. Air support was given by naval carrier forces, the Far East Air Force, and the RAAF. The enemy's forces of an estimated 225,000 include the 4th Army Group under command of Field Marshal Count Terauchi, of which 7 divisions have already been identified: 16th, 26th, 30th, 100th, 102nd, 103rd, and 105th. The strategic result of capturing the Philippines will be decisive. The enemy's so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere will be cut in two. His conquered empire to the south, comprising the Dutch East Indies and the British possessions of Borneo, Malaya and Burma, will be severed from Japan proper. The great flow of transportation and supply upon which Japan's vital war industry depends will be cut, as will the counter-supply of his forces to the south. 500,000 men will be cut off without hope of support, and with ultimate destruction at the leisure of the Allies, a certainty. In broad strategic conception, the defence line of the Japanese, which extends along the coast of Asia from the Japan Islands through Formosa, the Philippines, the East Indies, to Singapore and Burma, will be pierced in the centre, permitting an envelopment to the south and to the north. Either flank will be vulnerable and can be rolled up at will. The assault continued after a rapid consolidation of the first day's objectives. Numerous enemy counterattacks were beaten off in all areas during the next few days, as advancing forces reported increased resistance on every front. By the end of the third day, over 2,000 Japanese had been reported killed. On the 24th of October, elements of the X-Corps began a drive up the Leyte side of San Juanico Strait, while farther south, other units of the Corps pushed westward into Leyte Valley. The 96th Division, moving inland from Dulag, met heavy opposition from fortified positions on Catman Hill, a terrain feature dominating the division's zone of action and giving protection to enemy mortars lobbing shells toward the assault shipping in Leyte Gulf. Catman Hill was initially bypassed, then neutralized by naval guns and field artillery, and finally cleared of the enemy by October 31st. Recognition of the effort by all arms was contained in General MacArthur's report of October 25, 1944. Our ground forces have made extensive gains in all sectors. On the front of the 24 Corps, the 7th Division penetrated the enemy's covering screen to seize San Pablo Airdrome and fan out to the north toward Dagami. Elements of the 96th Division have enveloped Catman Hill and are approaching Tabon. In the northern sector, the X-Corps has made substantial gains to the west of Palo and Tacloban, and is pushing forward from the line of hills seized from the enemy which dominate the coast between Palo and Tacloban. Carrier aircraft of the 7th Fleet executed close support missions, attacking enemy ground installations, supply dumps, and lines of communication. On October 22 and 23, our planes struck enemy airdromes in the western Visayas and northern Mindanao. Targets included Cebu, Bacolod, Alicante, Fabrica, Buluan, and Del Monte. Our successful raids from all sources on the enemy's air installations are neutralizing his attempts at staging aircraft from Luzon and Borneo and have greatly restricted the scale of his air counter-offensive. While the Allies were fighting to improve their beachheads on Leyte, the Japanese were preparing to stake their entire remaining striking power on a gigantic gamble to maintain their positions in the Philippines. The role of the combined fleet in this critical battle was vital. Brilliantly conceived and immense in scope, the Japanese plan was to deliver a crippling attack against the US Navy and, with the strategic situation in their favor, to destroy in the same stroke General MacArthur's invasion at the beaches. The Japanese were willing to risk the loss of their entire mobile fleet for the one opportunity to maneuver their cruisers and battleships within target range of the troop and supply transports in Leyte Gulf. The decision to risk their most valuable military asset in an attempt to repel General MacArthur's invasion of Leyte emphasized again the importance the Japanese attached to the Philippines. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, was fully conscious of the hazards involved. Since without the participation of our combined fleet there was no possibility of the land-based forces in the Philippines having any chance against your forces at all, it was decided to send the whole fleet, taking the gamble. If things went well, we might obtain unexpectedly good results, but if the worst should happen, there was a chance that we would lose the entire fleet. But I felt that that chance had to be taken. Should we lose in the Philippines operations, even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off, so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese waters, could not obtain its fuel supply. If it should remain in southern waters, it could not receive supplies of ammunition and arms. there would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines. Based on similar strategic speculation, the Allied intelligence services assumed that the Japanese would employ the mass of their fleet to defend the Philippines. As invasion day approached, reconnaissance of every category was intensified to determine the location and movement of the Japanese Navy. It was expected that radio intercepts, aircraft and submarine sightings, and spot reports of AIB agents and guerrilla units in the Philippines would provide the necessary clues on the operations and intent of the Japanese fleet well enough in advance for proper countermeasures to be taken. Long before the actual battle for Leyte Gulf, evidence began to accumulate on the dispositions of the Japanese Navy. As early as October 16th, it was recognized that the heaviest concentration of Japanese fleet units was in the Singapore-Brunei area, that most of the remaining ships were located in Japanese home waters and Formosa, and that there were no important naval units in the Philippines. The logical conclusion was that if the Japanese used their fleet against General MacArthur's landing forces in the Philippines, they would probably converge from these two areas, with the stronger elements coming up from the south. The Japanese tactical plan was also diagnosed in part during the first week of October. The division of the enemy fleet between the Singapore-Brunei Bay area and Japan proper led to the assumption that the enemy's naval air strength would likely cooperate in the East China Sea Empire area, and that the whole remaining surface power would operate in the Sulu and South China Seas west of the Philippines. It was also recognized that one of the immediate dangers to General MacArthur's amphibious landings in the Philippines lay in a possible sortie by strong Japanese surface craft from Brunei Bay via Surigao Strait. As D-Day approached, the movements of the Japanese fleet were kept under close surveillance. For instance, on October 14th, a naval force consisting of Vice ADM Kiyohide Shima's minor units was sighted, en route to join the converging forces for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Admiral Shima's force was repeatedly sighted by Allied submarines and aircraft, and by October 23rd it became clear that Admiral Kurita's major units were also moving to attack the U.S. forces in the Philippines. This force, designated as the Central Force, originally consisted of 5 fast battleships, including the mysterious and dangerous 64 000-ton monsters, the Yamato and Musashi, along with 12 accompanying cruisers and 5 destroyers. At 0905 on the 24th of October, aircraft sighted a second enemy fleet off the Cagayan Islands, well into the Sulu Sea, on a course indicating an intent to enter the Mindanao Sea. Aerial attacks were launched almost immediately, with both bomb and rocket hits claimed on several of the Japanese units. This southern force, under Admiral Nishimura, although not as large as the previously located Central Force, showed enough strength in battleships and cruisers to identify it as a major task formation. It had left Brunei Bay on the 22nd of October and passed through Balabac Strait into the Sulu Sea around noon on the 23rd. Meanwhile, Admiral Shima had departed from Coron Bay at 0400 on the 24th of October and sailed southward. After rounding the Cagayan Islands, his small force of 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers turned eastward, where it was sighted west of Negros around noon. Admiral Shima followed Admiral Nishimura's southern force some 40 to 50 miles astern through the Mindanao Sea toward Leyte Gulf. With the sighting of the southern force, the form of the Japanese plan began to take shape. The Central Force, under Admiral Kurita, would pass through the Sibuyan Sea, emerge from San Bernardino Strait, and then set a course southward for Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, the southern force, under Admiral Nishimura, would pace its approach via the Mindanao Sea and Surigao Strait, so that both fleets, in a coordinated pincer movement, would converge simultaneously on the Allied flanks and attack the vulnerable, soft shipping busy unloading in Leyte Gulf. From the number and types of enemy warships moving through Philippine waters, it was apparent to General MacArthur's staff that the Japanese were launching a full-scale operation to destroy, or at least seriously disrupt, the invasion. That they would not employ their carriers in such an ambitious plan was unthinkable, yet the Japanese carriers had not been sighted. It could only be concluded that the missing carriers constituted another force not yet located, probably Admiral Ozawa's force, previously estimated to be somewhere in the Formosa Philippine Sea area. This opinion was strengthened on the morning of the 24th, when about 200 enemy planes launched a series of attacks concentrated mainly on the carriers of the Third Fleet. It was noted that a significant proportion of the attacking fighter planes consisted of carrier types. This fact, along with the direction of their approach, led Admiral Halsey to intensify his search to the north and east for some sign of enemy carriers. In the crucible of the coming battle, General MacArthur's position was unique. The sweep of his forces along New Guinea had been consistently directed to ensure that each operation would have the full protection of his own land-based air force. Every advance had been predicated on the basic plan of procuring air bases 200 to 300 miles apart, from which successive tactical advances could be made under a guaranteed air umbrella. However, by invading Leyte 2 months ahead of the original schedule, General MacArthur was compelled to send his troops into a landing area without his own controlled air coverage. The U.S. Navy therefore had a double responsibility. Initially, it had to assist the landing itself by its usual tasks of shore bombardment, convoy escort, and air cover. In addition, it had the important mission of giving General MacArthur further air support for a period of time beyond the landing date, until he could develop local airfields and stage his own air units forward from the south. At Leyte, General MacArthur was completely dependent on forces not under his control to protect his landing operation. Should the naval covering forces allow either of the powerful advancing Japanese thrusts to penetrate into Leyte Gulf, the whole Philippine invasion would be placed in grave jeopardy. It was imperative, therefore, that every approach to the Gulf be adequately guarded at all times, and that an enemy debouchement via Surigao and San Bernardino Straits be blocked with sufficient Allied naval strength. The naval forces protecting the Leyte invasion were disposed in 2 main bodies. The 7th Fleet, under Admiral Kinkaid, protected the southern and western entrances to Leyte Gulf, while the stronger 3rd Fleet, under Admiral Halsey, operated off Samar to cover San Bernardino Strait and approaches from the north and east. Admiral Halsey's immediate superior was Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii. Admiral Kinkaid was responsible to General MacArthur. While it was understood that such a division of command entailed certain disadvantages, it was theoretically assumed that frequent consultation and cooperative liaison would overcome any difficulties in the way of proper coordination. The coming battle was to demonstrate the dangers involved in the lack of a unified command and the misunderstandings that can arise during major operations in which the commander ultimately responsible does not have full control over all forces involved. As Admiral Kurita's central force threaded its way through the narrow, reef-filled waters of the Sibuyan Sea during the morning and afternoon of the 24th, it was subjected to repeated and severe attacks by planes of the U.S. Third Fleet. The Musashi, one of the newest and largest of Japan's battleships, was sunk. Its sister ship, the mighty Yamato, was hit. A heavy cruiser was crippled, and other cruisers and destroyers were damaged. The increasing force of these aerial blows, together with the torpedoes of 7th Fleet submarines, caused Admiral Kurita, who was operating without air cover, to reverse his course temporarily to reassess the situation and reform his forces. This temporary withdrawal, executed at 17:30, was later reported by overly optimistic Allied pilots as a possible retirement of the Japanese Central Force. Admiral Kurita had no intention of abandoning his mission, however, and at 17:40 he headed once more for San Bernardino Strait. Shortly thereafter, he received a message from Admiral Toyoda in Tokyo. All forces will dash to the attack, trusting in divine assistance. In the meantime, Admiral Nishimura's southern force sailed resolutely into the Mindanao Sea and past Bohol, despite having been sighted and attacked off Cagayan Island. Forewarned by these sightings, Admiral Kinkaid had dispatched almost the entire 7th Fleet's gunnery and torpedo force under Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf to intercept and destroy the approaching Japanese warships. Admiral Oldendorf took full advantage of both the geography of the battle area and his foreknowledge of the enemy's route of advance. PT squadrons were deployed at the entrance to Surigao Strait, at a place where the Japanese would have to reform in column to negotiate the narrow passage. Behind the torpedo boats, covering the northern part of the strait, were posted the destroyer squadrons, cruisers, and battleships to form a horizontal bar to a T of vast firepower, which the enemy would be forced to approach vertically as he moved forward. The ambush worked perfectly. As Admiral Nishimura's forces pushed forward through the smooth waters of Surigao Strait in the early hours of the 25th of October, the PT boats, waiting in the darkness near Panayon Island, launched their torpedoes. The results were not clear, but some damage was inflicted. 3 separate coordinated attacks by U.S. destroyer squadrons 54, 24, and 56 followed in rapid succession as torpedo after torpedo found its mark. Destroyer Squadron 54, operating near Kabugan Grande Island and Hibusan Island, launched its spread of torpedoes around 0300. A few minutes later, at 0327, Destroyer Squadron 24 fired its swift and deadly missiles from 700 yards off the port bow of the enemy formation. The third and final torpedo attack was made by Destroyer Squadron 56. At 0337, Admiral Oldendorf issued the order, "Launch attack, get the big boys." Admiral Nishimura's force was not only confused and slowed by the tempest of torpedoes, it was mortally crippled. Virtually every unit in the formation was either sunk or badly damaged. Despite this severe punishment, Admiral Nishimura's force steamed blindly ahead to its final doom in the death trap at the northern exit to Surigao Strait. There, in full battle formation, were Admiral Oldendorf's cruisers and battleships eagerly awaiting the ill-fated Japanese task force. At 0354, the battleships West Virginia, Tennessee, California, and Maryland opened fire in quick succession from a range of about 21,000 yards. The Mississippi followed with a single salvo at 0411. Within minutes, the withering hail of steel from Admiral Oldendorf's main battle line virtually completed the annihilation of Admiral Nishimura's force. The Japanese admiral himself went down with his flagship, the Yamashiro, which rapidly disintegrated after numerous torpedo hits. Only one lone destroyer, the Shigure, managed to survive the incredible carnage. In the meantime, Admiral Shima's cruiser and destroyer group, following some 40 miles astern of Admiral Nishimura's southern force, entered Surigao Strait around 0300. The southern force had already suffered heavy losses inflicted by the U.S. 7th Fleet, and from his flagship, the Nachi, Admiral Shima could see the smoke and flash of gunfire in the distance. After brief contact with the single surviving destroyer of the southern force, and a careless collision with one of its crippled cruisers, the Mogami, which was manoeuvring with broken steering gear, Admiral Shima retired southeastward into the Mindanao Sea and headed for Coron Bay. He did not escape unscathed, however, as he was attacked en route by Allied planes and lost one of his cruisers, which had been torpedoed earlier in the action. With the destruction of the Japanese southern force and the retirement of Admiral Shima's units, the Battle of Surigao Strait ended. The 7th Fleet had performed its mission with precision and effectiveness. The southern entrance to Leyte Gulf had been successfully closed, and General MacArthur no longer had to fear a Japanese naval threat from the south. While Admiral Kinkaid was preparing to meet the Japanese in Surigao Strait, Admiral Halsey was still trying to locate the suspected Japanese carriers. In the late afternoon of the 24th, scout planes of the 3rd Fleet finally reported a large enemy task force, including several carriers, off the northeastern coast of Luzon, about 300 miles from San Bernardino Strait. As Admiral Halsey plotted the position and strength of the newly sighted enemy carrier force, he continued to receive exaggerated reports of mounting damage inflicted by his attacking planes on the Japanese Central Force as it sailed through the Sibuyan Sea towards San Bernardino Strait. As later events proved, the pilots' reports were inaccurate regarding the status of both enemy forces. The firepower of the northern force was initially overestimated, as was the damage inflicted upon Admiral Kurita's Central Force. This faulty information was primarily responsible for several important subsequent decisions. The sighting of the carrier force presented a picture of three enemy fleets converging on the invasion area. The northern force moving southward in the Philippine Sea, the central force moving southeastward to San Bernardino Strait, and the southern force moving eastward toward the Mindanao Sea and Surigao Strait. Admiral Halsey felt that Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet had ample strength to meet the advancing southern force in Surigao Strait. He judged from his aviators' optimistic reports that the central force had been greatly damaged, had perhaps retired, and in all likelihood had been removed as a serious menace. He reasoned that, in any event, its strength had been reduced to the point where any threat it presented would be satisfactorily overcome by Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. He estimated that the northern force comprised the whole carrier strength of the Japanese, and therefore constituted the most potent danger to be met. Influenced by these factors, Admiral Halsey decided to move his entire force northward as a unit to intercept the Japanese carriers. During the afternoon of the 24th of October, Admiral Halsey organized Task Force 34 as a strong surface force comprising the battleships Iowa, New Jersey, Washington, and Alabama, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers. According to Admiral Halsey, the dispatch forming Task Force 34 was not an executive dispatch, but a tentative battle order, and was so marked. As everyone was greatly concerned about the Japanese central force, including Admiral Halsey, who knew its position and formidable firepower, it was assumed that Task Force 34 would engage Admiral Kurita's force, which was heading east through the Sibuyan Sea. In the early evening, Admiral Halsey informed Admiral Kinkaid and others of the position of the Japanese central force, and added that he was proceeding north with 3 groups to attack the enemy carrier forces at dawn. Accordingly, on the evening of the 24th, he withdrew the battleships, carriers, and supporting ships of the 3rd Fleet from San Bernardino Strait. This was a crucial decision, and no end of confusion and uncertainty followed his action. As the fast battleships of the 3rd Fleet had been detached from the carrier groups and organized as Task Force 34, it was assumed that Task Force 34 was still guarding San Bernardino Strait. Although no definite statement had been made to this effect by Admiral Halsey, Admiral Kinkaid thought that the big battleships were standing by, awaiting the Japanese central force, and that Admiral Halsey was going after the Japanese northern force with carrier units. However, Admiral Halsey took his 3 complete task groups on his run to the north and left San Bernardino Strait open. Free passage through San Bernardino Strait was a pivotal point of the enemy's strategy in his daring scheme to strike the Allies in Leyte Gulf. Admiral Halsey did not know that Japan's carriers were to be deliberately sacrificed in a bold gamble to keep the Philippines from falling to the Allies. It was later revealed that the northern force under Admiral Ozawa, almost completely destitute of planes and pilots, had only one mission: to serve as a decoy and lure the most powerful units of the U.S. fleet away from the Leyte area. It was expected that the northern force would probably be destroyed, but it was hoped that this desperate device would enable the Japanese central force to pass unmolested through San Bernardino Strait and move southward into Leyte Gulf, timing its approach to coincide with the arrival of the southern force from Surigao Strait. To accomplish his mission, Admiral Ozawa continually sent out radio messages in an effort to advertise his position to the U.S. fleet. An undetected fault in his transmission system, however, prevented the 3rd Fleet from intercepting these signals. Equally important to later operations, communication difficulties and divided responsibility also prevented an adequate exchange of information between the enemy's northern and central forces. As the U.S. 3rd Fleet sought contact with the carriers of the northern force during the evening of the 24th, Admiral Kurita, in a remarkable feat of high-speed navigation, skillfully led his warships through the darkness southeastward into the treacherous passes of the Sibuyan Sea. Since he had received no message from Admiral Ozawa off Luzon, he was unaware that the main body of the U.S. fleet had been drawn away from the mouth of San Bernardino Strait. Nevertheless, Admiral Kurita, in compliance with repeated orders from the combined fleet, continued on his original task, setting his course for Leyte Gulf. By midnight he was in the waters of San Bernardino Strait, and at approximately 0035 on the 25th of October, he debouched into the Philippine Sea. About 0530, as he was coming down the coast of Samar, Admiral Kurita received word of the loss of Admiral Nishimura's 2 battleships and of the damage to the cruiser Mogami. Although he was unaware of the fact, his was now the only Japanese force within striking distance of Leyte. The task of destroying the US invasion units rested solely in his hands. At dawn on the 25th of October, 3 groups of escort carriers under Admiral Thomas L. Sprague were disposed east of Samar and Leyte Gulf. The Northern CVE group, with 6 carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, was under the command of Rear ADM, Clifton A.F. Sprague. It was on a northerly course about 50 miles east of Samar and approximately halfway up the east coast of the island, directly in the path of Admiral Kurita's oncoming force. Some 20 or 30 miles east-southeast was the middle CVE group, with the same composition under Rear ADM, Felix B. Stump. Farther to the south, off northern Mindanao, was the southern CVE group consisting of 4 carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. This group was under the direct supervision of the overall escort carrier commander, Admiral Thomas Sprague. Through a series of fatal misunderstandings directly attributable to divided command, ambiguous messages, and poor communication between the US 3rd and 7th Fleets, neither Admiral Kinkaid at Leyte Gulf nor Admiral Sprague off Samar realized that the exit from San Bernardino Strait had been left unguarded. They had no reason to expect such a situation. Previous commitments were firm. During the night of the 24th, however, Admiral Kinkaid became uneasy concerning the actual situation at San Bernardino Strait and decided to check on the position of Task Force 34. At 0422 on the 25th, Admiral Kinkaid sent an urgent priority dispatch, 241912, telling Admiral Halsey of the results in Surigao Strait and asking him the vital question, "Is TF-34 guarding San Bernardino Strait?" The reply to Admiral Kinkaid's dispatch was not sent until 0704, by which time the first salvos of Admiral Kurita's battleships were reverberating across the waters off Samar. Admiral Halsey's answer said, "Your 2492 negative. Task Force 34 is with the carrier group now engaging enemy carrier forces." It was a dramatic situation fraught with disaster. The forthcoming battle between the US 7th Fleet's slow and vulnerable Jeep carriers and the Japanese Central Force of greatly superior speed and firepower gave every promise of a completely unequal struggle. The light carriers of Admiral Sprague were no match for the giant battleships and heavy cruisers of the Japanese Central Force. Should the enemy gain entrance to Leyte Gulf, his powerful naval guns could pulverize any of the eggshell transports still present in the area and destroy vitally needed supplies on the beachhead. The thousands of US troops already ashore would be isolated and pinned down helplessly between enemy fire from ground and sea. Moreover, the schedule for supply reinforcement would not only be completely upset, but the success of the invasion itself would be placed in grave jeopardy. The battleships and cruisers of the 7th Fleet were over 100 miles away in Surigao Strait, with their stock of armor-piercing ammunition virtually exhausted by the pre-landing shore bombardment and the decisive early morning battle with the Japanese Southern Force. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet was almost 300 miles away, still in hot pursuit of the Northern Force, and could not possibly return in time to halt the progress of Admiral Kurita. On shore, General MacArthur had been powerless to do more than point out the absolute need for constant carrier air cover over the Leyte beaches. Under the divided command setup, he had no effective control over the 3rd Fleet. Having advanced beyond the range of his own land-based aircraft, he was completely dependent upon carrier planes for protection, a fact he had emphatically made clear both before and during the planning for the invasion. On the 21st of October, he reiterated his conception of Admiral Halsey's mission, saying, "The basic plan for this operation, in which for the first time I have moved beyond my own land-based air cover, was predicated upon full support by the 3rd Fleet. Such cover is being expedited by every possible measure, but until accomplished, our mass of shipping is subject to enemy air and surface raiding during this critical period. Consider your mission to cover this operation is essential and paramount. Now, General MacArthur could do nothing but consolidate his troops, tighten his lines, and await the outcome of the impending naval battle. Although Admiral Kurita's central force had suffered considerable damage in its course across the Sibuyan Sea, it was still a formidable fleet when it broke through San Bernardino Strait and headed for Leyte Gulf. The main force consisted of the mighty Yamato and 3 other fast battleships, Kongo, Haruna, and Nagato. These were supported by the 6 heavy cruisers Chikuma, Haguro, Chokai, Tone, Kumano, and Suzuya. The 2 light cruisers Yahagi and Noshiro and 11 destroyers completed Admiral Kurita's fast and powerful task force. The first indication that the enemy might be approaching came at 0637, when the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay intercepted Japanese conversation on the Interfighter Director Net. This was followed closely by sightings of anti-aircraft bursts to the northwest, about 20 miles distant. The final shock came at 0647, when a pilot aboard a plane from the Kadeshian Bay dramatically announced that a large enemy surface force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers was closing in about 20 miles to the northwest at a speed of 30 knots. The frightful possibility had materialized. The Japanese Central Force had broken through San Bernardino Strait. At 0644, and a few minutes later, at 0658, he gave the order to join battle. The Yamato's 18-inch guns fired first, with the cruisers following as soon as they came within range. Never before had U.S. warships been subjected to such heavy-caliber fire. With the world's biggest guns blazing away, Admiral Kurita pressed the attack at full speed.